and we are joined now by David Zweig, investigative journalist and author. He's got a brand new book. I think you guys are going to love it. I've already started to check it out. I've got it at the home. Buck is holding it up right now. An Abundance of Caution, American Schools, the Virus, and a Story of Bad Decisions. David, thanks for joining us in our New York City studio. I know we've had you on before, and I think it's fair to say that a lot of your reporting was not necessarily well received by people on the left, and that you are not some far right-wing conspiracy theorist. You just did something wild. You looked at the data, and you were willing to write about what the data showed, and you were, as Buck and I have both been, profoundly angered and still angry over the failures of American public policy as it pertains to COVID. What pushed you to write this book, and what do you hope that people take from it?
Yeah, that's a very good assessment. In the beginning, very early on, it seemed reasonable to me. I wasn't knowledgeable about what was happening. I live right outside New York City. Okay, the schools are closed, everything's shut down. But very quickly after that, I watched my kids just wilting away in the kind of the gray light of their Chromebooks, sitting alone in their bedrooms. And I was like, this isn't going to work for a long period of time. Like how can this be? And from there, I just started kind of researching and digging in. I was in the middle of writing a book on a totally different topic at the time, but this was just so crazy what was happening. I wanted to learn more about what was going on. And very quickly, I started to speak with experts in Europe and elsewhere, because you couldn't speak to them in the United States. And it was very obvious that there was no reason for the schools to remain closed. And that kind of set me off on this path. And as you noted, this very much was, what was termed a contrarian view against the establishment. And it was certainly a challenging position for me, writing for mainstream publications, to get my reporting in there. But I pulled it off. And I think people kind of perceive me, I think it's true, as basically the only guy who's really able to do that, to write a number of pieces. They were all backed by evidence showing why the establishment view was so wrong.
David, you said something I want to return to, if I can. You said that there was no reason for the schools to be closed. There was no medical reason for the schools to be closed, but I am sure in the course of your research, you found a whole slew of non-medical reasons or rationales or horse trading that led to the continuation of public school closures. While, I grew up in New York City, so I know that system pretty well. Went to Catholic school there. There's private schools, parochial schools, public schools. Parochial and private were open for business in that fall after the initial pandemic, and yet public schools were remote. Why?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's so remarkable, and it's almost astonishing that this actually happened in real time, and it's kind of one of the main reasons of why I wrote this book, was to make sure that what happened isn't just memory hold. And the idea, as you noted, kids were in school in private schools. They were in school in red districts and in red states, while at the same time, a kid could be down the block in public school and he was kept home. While his best friend, in a different area or went to private school, was in school every day. So the irony to me is that on the left, which traditionally perceives itself as being the heroes of the underprivileged in our society, they championed the rules and the guidelines and the policies that actually harmed underprivileged kids the most. And it's like one of the most tragic ironies of the pandemic to me, that this was the result, that you had people vigorously, it wasn't just advocating, but as you know, anyone who disagreed was immediately vilified. You were some right-wing crank. You were a piece of garbage if you disagreed with them.
Well, I mean, I am a right-wing crank, so I can imagine what it would be like for you being
I was a turncoat.
You're not one.
Yeah, I was Benedict Arnold here. I was immediately cast aside. I was called a murderer. How could you do this? One of the things that's so important that and this is kind of like the original sin that I talk about in the book, at the end of April and the beginning of May in 2020, schools began to open in Europe. And it's not just like some little school in Tibet somewhere with 12 kids. We're talking about millions of kids were back in school. And the European Union, the education ministers met in May. And at that meeting, they said, we have observed no negative consequences of opening our schools. They met a second time in June. They had the same determination. No one reported this. I ultimately reported it myself in June, but this is kind of an astonishing thing. This wasn't, a random blog. This wasn't an obscure medical journal. This is the European Union, and their official announcement regarding opening schools where millions of kids were in there was no negative consequence. And as far as I am aware, no one in the U.S. media reported on this meeting. That sort of set things on the course, where we were just kind of never to come back from that.
Okay, so I want that's an important point. I want you to expound upon something that happened that a lot of people have forgotten. In June of 2020, and I may get the official name wrong, but it was like the American Association of Pediatricians or something like that, said schools needed to open back up and we could do it safely. That was a big story in June. And then Randy Weingarten and the American Federation of Teachers somehow kind of got into their universe, and they ended up, I'm sure it's in the book.
It is, indeed.
They ended up reversing their guidance. What do you think now when you see Randy Weingarten going around on shows saying, I never said that I wanted schools to be shut down? What does the evidence show us, and how important was it from a science perspective for those pediatricians? And I remember their argument being, David, correct me if I'm wrong, that while the virus wasn't going to go away, kids had far more to gain by being in school than they did to fear from the virus. That was June of 2020. And then they completely reversed themselves under political pressure.
So what happened was the American Academy of Pediatrics put out a guidance that was unambiguous. It said, we've got to get kids in school. Don't even worry about 6 feet of distancing. If you can do it, great. But if you can't, don't worry. Just 3 feet is fine, whatever. Just get the kids in the building. Shortly thereafter, Donald Trump tweeted, we must open schools in the fall, all caps with a bunch of exclamation points. Within days, the American Academy of Pediatrics put out a new statement. Gone was any mention of don't worry about distancing. Gone was the idea of get kids in school no matter what. And instead, they mentioned money. It's really important for a lot of money to flow to schools. And then the second important thing about that revised statement was who authored it. And it wasn't just the American Academy of Pediatrics. It was co-authored with the 2 largest teachers unions in the country. It was so stark what happened that even NPR reported on this. But I got to tell you, this is part of a larger thing. And I talk about this a lot in the book, where I show this behind the scenes thing that was going on. So as I started writing these articles, challenging the sort of dogma and the establishment view, people started reaching out to me from around the country, parents, regular people, but also a lot of doctors. And these are doctors, not just some suburban pediatrician, but people who are at elite institutions, our top, university hospitals in the country. And they were saying, hey, thank you so much for writing this. I just want you to know, I think it's terrible what's happening with kids. I think these policies for keeping schools closed and these mask mandates, there isn't good evidence behind this. Schools are open in Europe, all these things. And they said, but all this has to be off the record, because they were afraid to be cast out by their peers, or in many instances, they were explicitly told, and I have examples of this in the book, they were explicitly told by their superiors, by the administrators at their hospitals, do not say anything about this. So I had this bizarre experience where I'm observing this narrative that's going on in the culture, this sort of manufactured consensus that wasn't real. And I had this very lonely, strange experience where I'm getting all these text messages and emails, and I'm talking with all these doctors who are disagreeing with this, but the dissent was silent. I wasn't allowed to talk about it, and they were too afraid or weren't allowed to speak about it themselves. So my book gives what I hope is this deep behind the scenes account of what actually happened during the pandemic, not the narrative that we were all fed. And I'm hoping that when people finish reading this, that they're going to be armed with enough information so they can actually understand and see how the gears turn within the legacy media and how they turn where they were working in conjunction with different institutions of power. So it's not just for a pandemic, but for when any other crisis happens, that your listeners, when they're like, oh, I read about that in Zweig's book, I see exactly what's happening now.
We're speaking to David Zweig. The book is An Abundance of Caution. I have my copy in my hands here. American Schools, the Virus, and a Story of Bad Decisions. One of the reasons we want to have you on, David, is we like to reward people who were right when it mattered and did good work when it mattered on this issue. So congrats on the book, and we hope people will pick up a copy because I think it's very important, right? It's a lot easier for people to jump on the bandwagon now, but we know that you were early on this and you got heat. To that end, just one. I mean, Clay might have a question for you in closing. I don't know if you're a sports fan or you like the SEC or anything, but that's always a possibility here at the end, too. But if you were to walk around right now, sort of tell us what it's like on the other side a bit, because they'll still talk to you. They won't talk to us that much. Some of them listen to the show because it is so entertaining. But generally speaking, we have a center to right audience. If you walked around Park Slope or you walked around I don't know, Santa Monica, and just talk to people who watch, I don't know, CNN, read the New York Times, the LA Times, and said, hey guys, the next time around, we're all clear that we don't shut down the schools for this, right? Are they clear on that?
I think there's been a softening. So I think that's the good news. The bad news is that there is this revisionist history. There's this narrative that they've been pushing, which is, in the beginning it was, we have to close schools, we have to do all this stuff. Eventually, when it was so obvious that wasn't beneficial, it was so obvious this was only causing harm, then they shifted. Then the narrative was, well, this is regrettable, but it was an understandable thing. This was a fog of war decision. It was chaos. We did the best we could. And what I show in the book over and over is that information was known in real time. And that example about the European Union is just one of many. They knew what was happening. It was ignored or it was dismissed. So when you ask me that question, my fear is that when the next crisis happens, and it doesn't have to be a pandemic, that once again, that there's this excuse of, we're building the plane as we fly it. We don't know. Sorry, we're doing the best we can. Don't accept it. It's not true. Demand evidence. And that's what my book is about at its core, is you can't say stuff without providing evidence. And over, and I cite these long examples in the New York Times and all these other media outlets, they kept quoting all these experts saying things, but they didn't provide any evidence. They never challenged them. Journalists shirked their core duty, which was to actually question the statements by those in power. So I'm hoping my book will act as a corrective, as this is an actual real history of what happened, and it works as its own guidebook to help arm people to understand how the gears turn behind the scenes so we can try to prevent something like this from happening again.
Last question. You came from the left. And Buck's right. I'm just curious from your perspective. We hope that the historic record 20, 40 years, 60 years from now is going to be a worthy lesson. How much less faith do you personally have in the so-called legacy media than you did before COVID happened? So David Zweig 2019 compared to David Zweig 2025, how are you different?
I would say, if I may, not just the legacy media, but the entire left establishment, if you will. My experience during the pandemic and what I observed and what I experienced as a journalist actually chasing down the evidence and the facts has completely shattered my entire worldview that I had. I was a smug liberal. I've always been an independent. I was not like a staunch Democrat. So I was an independent-minded person, but I tended to believe in these institutions. And what I observed and experienced was the absolute failure. And these people who were the good guys, I recount some stuff in the book about, I had evidence from Arizona, the state itself, which differed from a study that the CDC put out. And when I contacted the CDC, I said, hey, I have evidence that I have data that's differing from what you have in your study. And I knew what they had was wrong because I had the official data. And their response to me was, we looked through it. There are no errors. You can't come back from something like that. And I remember just kind of hunched over with a migraine that night talking to my wife. So to answer your question, I just feel entirely differently about how the world works. And you just can't recover from something like that when, you would think something like the NSA or Defense Department might pull some type of BS on that. This was a health department, and the CDC, they were lying through their teeth right to me in email saying there were no errors when I knew they knew that I knew, and I knew that they knew that I knew that this was complete BS and they didn't care. You can't recover from something like that. So my book is filled with kind of that type of stuff where this was almost like a cathartic endeavor where I had to set the record straight so people, and hopefully not just your audience, though I know they're going to be receptive, I think, but I'm hoping that I can persuade some independent-minded people as well. That's my real goal, is like to help people see what's really going on.
David Zweig, everybody, an abundance of caution. David, thank you so much.
Yeah,
the Preborn Network of Clinics has a team of people who live by a mission to save the lives of unborn babies. They see the access and widespread availability of abortions for pregnant women debating such a decision, and Preborn does all they can to convince a pregnant mother there's a better option than abortion. Give life to that tiny baby growing inside them. They accomplish this with just a $28 expense, a dollar figure you and I can donate knowing it well may save a life, and so often it does. Preborn operates clinics in communities across our nation where abortion rates are highest. They do this on purpose. The resources and services they offer, including that ultrasound to meet that unborn baby, really gives mom another option, a better one. In 20 years' time, they've saved 300,000 plus lives to date. To donate securely, dial pound 250 and say the keyword baby. That's pound 250, say baby, or visit preborn.com/buck. Preborn.com/BUCK. Sponsored by Preborn.